I'm just delighted as the Bishop of the Diocese of Quebec to have the opportunity to say a word at the beginning of this introduction that you're going to have to this wonderful place, the Cathedral of the Holy Trinity here in Quebec City, a truly very historical and wonderful cathedral. In year 2004, the celebration of the 200th anniversary of this cathedral, which is the oldest Anglican cathedral outside of the British Isles. That's an important thing about this cathedral in Quebec. I suppose I could say, first of all, how enormously important this building and this community is to me personally. I was ordained in 1964 as a deacon and in 1965 as a priest. Those were my first contacts with the Cathedral of the Holy Trinity in Quebec City, and enormously important, ordained by Bishop Russell Brown. Then it's also the place where my wife and I were married in 1982. And then in 1991 I was ordained as bishop for the Diocese of Quebec in this same place. We've also had one of our third child was baptized here, and somewhat before I was married, I was made a canon of the cathedral by my predecessor as bishop. So I've been very close to it for a long time, and it is a wonderful place. So I'm glad that you're going to have an opportunity to see the cathedral, to see inside the cathedral, and to hear something of its very important ministry. As I greet you and welcome you to the cathedral, I happen to know that the cathedral is having a particularly vital ministry at the moment. The dean and the honorary assistant clergy and the lay leadership are providing a tremendously vital ministry in this place and most importantly towards this city and the diocese. So, welcome to the Cathedral of the Holy Trinity, and I hope you enjoy this story and introduction to a wonderful place.
Welcome to the Cathedral of the Holy Trinity. Bienvenue à la Cathédrale Holy Trinity. My name is Walter Raymond, and I have the distinct privilege of serving as the Dean of the Cathedral. In fact, this is my stall in the Cathedral. This building was completed 200 years ago in 1804, and it was built largely thanks to the generosity of King George III, and it is, in fact, a royal foundation. But it's more than just an interesting place and a historic building. It's also the home of a vital and dynamic community of Christians, of people whose lives are centered on God, and who gather here to worship Sunday after Sunday, and who are joined by visitors who come to Quebec City from all around the world, and perhaps you're one of them. In any case, today I've invited a few friends from the cathedral, members of our community, to come and to share with us some of the interesting points about this place, to show us around. And I hope you enjoy the program we've prepared for you today. Many of our visitors and those who come here for worship on Sunday comment on the spirit of calm and peace that seems so present in the cathedral. And I've no doubt that a large part of that has to do with the very pleasing proportions and architectural design and decoration of the building. To tell us more about this cathedral, its design and its decoration, I've invited Mr. David Mendel, who is the president of a company called Canadian Cultural Landscapes, which specializes in cultural tourism, particularly to Quebec City. David is a member of our cathedral community. He is our head verger, and he is a member of the executive of the Cathedral Foundation. And he has a real heart for this cathedral. He's one of the biggest advocates in the community for the preservation and conservation of the cathedral and its precincts. David, thanks for taking a moment to speak with us.
Pleasure.
Now, when we look at the outside of the cathedral, what is it we should be paying attention to?
Well, the church was built between 1800 and 1804, designed by British officers, and according to the quite a long description they wrote, it's a reduced and simplified version of St. Martin in the Fields in London. Now, if you know that church on Trafalgar Square, you'll realize that it's quite a simplified version of it. The church on Trafalgar Square has a large portico with massive columns in front, Corinthian columns, and that was simply not possible to do in the colonial context here. The state of the quarries at the time didn't allow them to extract stones big enough, so they compromised and placed flat columns called pilasters on the facade. But what I find most interesting is the shape of the pediment, that triangular form beneath the roofline. If you think back to the temples of ancient Greece and Rome, it doesn't quite have the right proportions. It's too high and steep. The interesting thing is that when they first built the church, the pediment did have the right shape, but they had so much trouble with snow accumulation and water infiltration that they decided to build a new higher roof right over the old one and raise the front and back walls to meet it. Another thing is that the tower, which was very different from any other church tower which had been seen here before, modeled on St. Martin's in the Fields, was quite a bit shorter in height than the one in London, but had a great influence on the city, and many Catholic architects later on, and for French churches, took their inspiration from it here in the Quebec City region.
And you mentioned one of the Protestant churches
as well. Yeah, the St. Andrew's steeple is based on it. We can think of some Catholic ones, like for example the church at Saint-Laurent, Ile d'Orléans, island of Orleans.
Yeah, that's right. Now we say that this is the first cathedral, the first cathedral in North America,
built outside the British Isles. In fact, it's because there were no dioceses in the colony until shortly before then. With the American Revolution, though, with the creation of a new Episcopal church in what was now becoming the United States at the end of the 1700s, it was decided that also because the English were establishing themselves here in a place where the majority of the population was Catholic, that it was important to establish a diocese here in North America. The first one was established in Nova Scotia, which was based in Halifax, and it encompassed this whole area. And then in 1793 it was decided to make one specifically for what was called the Diocese of Quebec, which was nevertheless a huge diocese. And the church, St. Paul's in Halifax, was used as a cathedral. It was built in 1750, but it was not built as a cathedral. So this church was the first church to be built as an Anglican cathedral outside the British Isles.
Well, that's very interesting. Now, when we move inside the cathedral, I understand that this is a pretty important building when we look inside it.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is actually the most authentic historic church interior which has survived in Quebec City up to the present day. The Catholic cathedral had to be rebuilt after a fire in 1922. The Ursuline Chapel has an ancient interior dating back to the 1730s, but the building itself was completely reconstructed at the beginning of the 20th century, and they had to reintegrate the ornamentation into it. So this church is the only one that has survived with modifications over time, but which has remained intact for so long.
Now, you talk about modifications over time. What would be different today than there was, say, 200 years ago?
Well, there was quite a different feeling when you came into the church in 1804 when it was completed. First of all, the pulpit was not on the side where it is today. It was right in the center of the aisle, in front of the altar, in front of the sanctuary, and it was almost as high as the gallery beside it. And that reflected the influence of the Reformation on the Anglican Church up until that time. Also, no stained glass windows. You have to think of it more like a New England meeting house. Have you been to one of those where you have clear glass windows and you could look out onto the city and the surrounding area? So a very different feeling in that way as well.
We were talking about the changes in the interior of the church. So the move of the pulpit out, were there any other changes as well? Or?
In the latter part of the 19th century, the very end of the 19th century, there were some major changes which reflected the ecclesiological movement which had begun in Cambridge and Oxford in the 19th century. They wanted to go back to the Church of England before the Reformation, and they took their inspiration from Gothic churches of the past. St. Matthew's Church, for example, here in Quebec City is a good example with a deep chancel and Gothic architecture. Here they were able to modify the church only to a certain extent. Reflecting the values of the ecclesiological movement, they wanted to put the emphasis back on the ceremony of Holy Communion, more so than the sermon in a sense, and readings from the Bible. And so they moved the pulpit over to the side, made it lower, they gave the altar more importance by raising it by a couple of steps, and it becomes the center of the composition, the center of the service in many ways with this ecclesiological movement. And the color scheme at that time, at the beginning of at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, was quite different. Golds and dark colors and so on. This was all part of this effort to make a more mysterious sanctuary area which would emphasize the ceremony of Holy Communion. And in more recent restoration work, we're now back to the light colors of the neoclassical architecture that we had in the beginning.
So they actually, it was a darker, or was it?
Yeah, there are pictures in Nopin's book. Where
I thought it was like soot and stuff like that.
No, they actually painted it. This was part of the aesthetics. If you look at the organ, that gives you an idea a bit of what the colors would have been like.
Okay.
That goes back to that color scheme.
Okay. Well, David, thank you very much for spending some time with us today, and it was very interesting.
Thank you. Nice talking with you.
One of my favorite people in the cathedral community is Mr. Alex Addy. Mr. Addy has served this cathedral for more than 45 years as a tour guide and was baptized here in 1908. I've asked Dr. Meb Reisner, professor at Laval University and the official historian for the Diocese of Quebec, to interview Mr. Addy for us.
So, Mr. Addy, tell me something about the various memorials that we see behind us.
Well, the first bishop of this church, Bishop Mountain, his memorial is on the left-hand side there. There's the bishop there, and the woman beside him was supposed to be Virtue. But we always knew it as the bishop and his wife. And then the bishop, the memorial to Bishop Stewart is over on that side. Under the plaque right there is buried the Duke of Richmond. He was the commander of the British cavalry in the Battle of Waterloo, did a good job. As a reward, the king made him Governor General of Canada. No sooner gets here, a little fox bites him and killed him. He went through two battles in Europe without a scratch. Little fox killed him.
And he's buried in the crypt under the cathedral.
He's buried in the crypt under right under that plaque, actually. Bishop Mountain is also buried under the plaque, and a baby. And nobody really knows who the baby is. She was 1932, I guess, when Crowfoot, Dean Crowfoot, Dick Williams, the verger, and Leslie Stewart, the warden, went down to see how the crypt was holding up. They were surprised to find an amount of silt in there, and that's when they found the third sarcophagus. They thought at the time that it was probably the Duke's favorite hound. They did that in England. Apparently, his favorite hound was buried when he was buried. And they thought this third one was probably the hound. They opened it, and it was the remains of a very small child.
But there's no record.
There's no record. My own personal opinion is, we know that Jehoshaphat Mountain, who was dean of this cathedral, lost a child when it was very small. In fact, shortly after it was born, which would just fit that child. And my theory is that it is Jacob Mountain's child.
George Josephat Mountain's child.
Yeah. Well, that's a guess. But I can't think of any other reasonable reason why it would be there.
Well, with all the work that's done on DNA today, who knows, perhaps they could
Well, it's
they
possible.
could find out.
It's possible, yes. It'd be interesting to find out, yeah.
Now, that George Jehoshaphat mountain that you mentioned is memorialized in the window.
That's right.
Over the altar.
Now, that window is the most beautiful thing made by Clutterbuck and Son of London in 1816. 1816.
Well, he died in 1863, George Jehoshaphat Mountain.
Yeah. But well, it would be about that time. The most beautiful thing in that window there, if you look at the figure in blue on the left-hand side, he's got his hand out and his thumb is up. If you look right at the end of the thumb onto the green, even now you can see a slight discoloration of the green. When the sun shines on it directly, or in the old days when we had a floodlight on that window in the winter, you can see that discoloration is a footmark.
Ah.
Christ has risen, but he's left his mark on the earth. It's a very beautiful window. An interesting thing was, right in the center of the aisle there was a fall stool. That was built by a fellow whose grandfather did the carving for Christopher Wren and St. Paul's and Lincoln cathedrals. It's a very beautiful thing. Somebody told me that there must be an error in the carving. So I took a stool and a powerful light and spent a couple of hours going over that inch by inch, and I couldn't find one single error. It's a beautiful piece of work.
It's very elaborately carved, isn't it?
It's beautiful, beautiful.
Well, Mr. Addy, thank you so much for telling us about the cathedral and your involvement with it over these many years.
Cathedral in my day.
The cathedral in your day. Thanks so much.
You're welcome.
One of the very first things that people hear as they come near the cathedral, and in fact many people are drawn to the cathedral when they hear them, are the cathedral bells. And to tell us more about the bell tower, our 8 bells, and how bell ringing works, we've invited Doug Kitson, who is the captain of the Cathedral Bell Tower, to speak with us. Douglas, thank you for agreeing to interview or to talk about the bell tower. How long have there been bells in the cathedral?
The bells were cast in 1830 in Whitechapel in London, and they were installed in the same year, and they were rung later on that same year.
How often are the bells rung?
We ring for every service on Sunday, and we have a practice on Thursday evenings for the adults and on Saturday mornings for the new youth group that's starting up.
Yes, so you have some young people interested in ringing bells?
Yes, they've just started it. We have about 5 or 6 young people in there, from about 12 up to about 15.
So it's not a problem of being too small? I mean, is there a certain, how heavy or how hard is it to ring the bells?
Our bells need to be rehung, so they're quite difficult to ring. So the young people won't be able to ring bigger than the front 3 or 4 bells. After that, they'd be too heavy.
Right.
But once the bells are rehung, young people should be able to handle all but the very biggest, probably.
Right. So now, in learning to ring a bell, what's involved? How long does it take, and what are sort of the steps?
The simplest thing one gets to ring is called rounds, where you ring the bell in order from the smallest bell to the largest bell with an equal space. That normally takes between 2, 3, 4 months of practice to get to that point.
Right. So that'd be da 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 da. That's
exactly, yes.
Yes. And so that just to learn to ring your bell when it's your turn.
Yeah, well, first of all, you have to learn to handle a single bell by itself.
Right.
You don't worry about anybody else.
Right.
Once you're able to control that, then we start integrating you into rounds
right.
to ring exactly after the person who is standing on your right-hand side.
As we watch the children ring, or the adults ringing too, there seem to be 2 motions. Could you explain a bit how that works?
Yes, up in the bell tower where the bells are, the bell is attached to a very large wheel. Perhaps 5 feet, 6 feet in diameter, and the rope coils around the wheel. So you turn the bell 360 degrees, it's inverted, So on one direction, you have a lot of rope falling around your feet, and the other direction, you have no rope, your hands are way extended up above your head. So you have the two pulls of the bell, on the backstroke and the hand stroke.
And backstroke would be?
On the very end of the rope.
Right.
The hand stroke is part way up the rope where there's a rubber padding called the sally.
Right. So if I understand correctly, then the bell, if you were to look at the bell as like a cup, that the cup is pointed up when it's in ring position?
Yes,
or?
the mouth is upwards, and then you pull it so that it turns 360 degrees.
Comes all the way around.
And then you pull it back the other way.
Okay.
And you could actually balance it upside down with the aid of a small stick called the stave.
Now, after you've learned how to do rounds, what do we mean when we talk about change ringing?
Okay, the rounds is going from the smallest to the biggest bell, and we always start ringing and end ringing with rounds. The next stage is called change ringing, which is when the conductor calls two bells and they change places. So, for example, if the smallest bell is always the smallest number, so it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So the conductor could call 2 to 3, and then the bells would ring 1, 3, 2, 4, 5, 6.
Okay, so that's the change.
Yes.
It's as simple as that.
And
It's only two bells at a go?
In change ring, there's only two bells at a time, and you can only change a bell a single place at a time. So if you want the first bell to ring last, you have to work it up, position by position by position.
Oh, okay. That's a bit
You
like
can't just jump it.
Like Magic Cube or something like
Yes,
that kind of a thing. How long does it take then to say ring through all of the possibilities of if you were to move all these bells around?
Well, on 8 bells, it would probably take a couple of weeks.
Really?
Yes.
So
The numbers become incredible.
So what's a peal then? What do we mean by
A peal is the time it takes for 7 bells to ring the combinations. It means each of the bells are ringing 5,000 times. And that takes about 3 hours to ring a peal.
So you're doing that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and then you're doing that 1, 2, 4, 3, 5, 6, 7.
Well, the patterns are much more complicated than that,
right.
and some have existed for hundreds of years, and some are quite new.
They seem to have all kinds of names. And
Yes, often named after the first city they were rung in.
Right.
So there's London, Surprise Major, Cambridge, Yorkshire. There are lots of names, and some are named after people. Stedman is named after the person who, in some ways, invented method ringing.
Now, this tower here, where does it sort of stand in the history of bell towers in this continent? Or?
Well, it's the first change ringing tower in Canada. The bells at Old North in Boston are quite a bit older. They were from the mid 1700s, before the Revolution. And there are now 7 towers in Canada.
7 towers in Canada. North America, there would be?
There are about 30 to 40 in the States.
Now, the change ringers are quite a close family of sorts. I mean, you seem to have lots of visitors that come through to ring bells.
Unfortunately, we don't have enough, because it'd be great to have even more, seeing we are one of the most isolated towers in the world. Our closest change ringing tower is in Boston, which is an 8-hour drive away. Whereas if you ring in England, then within a half-hour drive, you probably have 30 towers.
Right.
So it's a really different.
Also, there are really hundreds and hundreds of towers in England.
No,
not
thousands.
Thousands.
There are about 5,500 in England.
Right.
That's not counting the rest of the British Isles.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Douglas. That's a lot of information.
Oh, you're welcome.
I'm standing next to the bishop's throne. This is the Cathedral. This is what makes this building a cathedral. And it's an interesting piece of furniture. It was made from wood that came from a tree that was on the cathedral property that was knocked down by lightning in the 1880s. And the tree had been there for many, many years, and before the arrival of Europeans was considered sacred to the First Nations, the Indians of this region. In fact, Jacques Cartier and Samuel de Champlain negotiated, smoked the peace pipe with people underneath that tree. And so we have a bit of sacred history right here in this furniture. It is one of many objects in the cathedral and in our vault that are of tremendous interest and value. And to tell us more about the ongoing work of conservation and our cathedral collection, I've invited Diana Meredith, a member of our cathedral community, who is in fact our verger conservator. She's responsible for looking after our treasures, to come and talk to us today. I suppose your first interest or primary interest is in the fabric arts.
Yes, I started with fabrics. I mean, because that's always been an interest way back before I became as involved as I am in the cathedral. And then one thing does lead to another. So from fabric, I moved to silver, from silver to other objects around the cathedral.
And was a huge project was the restoration of the what we call the centennial frontal.
Yes, the white frontal, which everybody's always been very fond of. So it's been much used over the 100 years we've had it. But by about the 1980s, 90s, it was getting terribly worn out and badly needed some repairs. And we did this big restoration project with the help of the Centre de Conservation du Quebec. It was a combination, a partnership between professionals and volunteers.
Now, the fabric arts, I suppose one could think that that was about conserving the past, but in fact, in recent months, you've been at work creating some new material, new frontal.
We learned a lot on this. In the terms of conservation, we learned a great deal about fabrics and how to construct a big piece that would hang, a liturgical hanging, if you like, so that having learnt all that through conserving and preparing an old one, we applied some of those techniques to the creation of a new piece, which we did in 2003. So we now have an additional green frontal, which is a color that is used a great deal, so a new one was quite useful.
Now, you mentioned that not only the fabric arts have been an interest to you, but we've also have an important collection of silver at the cathedral.
Well, we were fortunate with our connection to the Centre de Conservation and also the funding program that was set up in 1995 by the provincial government, providing funds for heritage churches. And with those two advantages, we got the funds to repair some of the silver.
Now there are these marks on a cup like this, the silver marks.
Yes, the British.
What do they? There's a system, I think.
The British silver, yes, has a silver manufactured in Britain had a special marking system which gives you exact reference as to where and when it was made. And the 3 marks on this silver goblet indicate that it is made of sterling silver. There's a lion. This little stamp of a lion indicates that. The next stamp is a leopard's head, which indicates that it was made in London. And the final, third stamp is a letter, and the letter is B, and the font, if you can, the font or the style of the letter indicates that the letter B refers to the year 1757. The alphabet was used repetitively, but each time they used the alphabet, they changed the style of lettering, the font, if you like.
So this chalice would have arrived in the colony shortly after the arrival of the British, I guess.
I suppose 1757 it was made, so it would have arrived within a few years of later than that date. 59
or 60. Now the star collection in our cathedral vault would be the silver that was given to us.
Yes, the 10 pieces of Georgian silver. They were given by George III when the cathedral was founded. And they're very ornate and very beautiful. And they would date back to about 1803, 1804, I think.
So I believe they were commissioned in 1804 and arrived here in 1807.
Yes. Was that it? Yeah. Anyway, some of those pieces did need repair, and that's where we took them to the Centre de Conservation again, and some work was done on several of those pieces. Another big project, at least in terms of hours, was the restoration of the Royal Arms, which was restored and repaired in the Atelier de Sculpture au Centre de Conservation du Quebec. And that is now much more complete. Little broken pieces have been replaced and the paint has been refreshed.
What sort of projects do you have in the future for restoration?
There's some still repairs to be done, on smaller repairs, not a big project like the complete remaking of the white frontal.
That was big enough, I think, for a while.
Well, yes, but there's a smaller repair on one of the red frontals. If I can find my stitching friends and my faithful bénévoles will still be available. We're going to do that this winter.
I suspect they will be.
I think so, if we can get it started.
Well, Diana, thank you very much for spending some time with us today.
Oh, I'm glad to be able to talk about it. It's been a great interest to me, and one thing does lead to another, I find, in my life, and so who knows what's coming next.
Indeed. Well, thank you very much. This cathedral was built to the greater glory of God, and it really is a temple of worship, and surely one of the most remarkable treasures of Anglican cathedral worship is its long and outstanding tradition of music. To talk to us about the tradition of music and the place of music in our worship life today, I've invited Dr. Benjamin Waterhouse to come and speak with us. Benjamin is the organist and choir master here at the cathedral, and he is part of what we might call the living treasure of the cathedral today.
Yes, well, my official title is organist and choir master, so I'm responsible for playing the organ during the services and also for working with the choir. I direct the choir, I take the rehearsal on Sunday mornings, and I conduct during the services. And I suppose I also have a general responsibility for music in the cathedral, for choosing repertoire.
What role does music play in the life of a cathedral like this?
Well, right now the music plays a very important role. It's an important part of each service, and I think the visitors who come to the cathedral appreciate the music a lot. And actually, I've been doing a bit of research on the history of the organ, and one of the things that I find quite striking is that when the cathedral was built in 1804, when it was opened in 1804, it already had an organ. They'd sent to England, and an organ builder called George Eliot had built the first organ for the cathedral. So even when the cathedral opened, music was a very, very important part of its life.
Now, that's not the organ that's in the loft now, or?
That was an organ by George Eliot. That lasted from about 1804 to the 1840s, and then it was replaced by another instrument from England built by Bevington. And the organ that we see in the church right now, the case and the pipes are at the back of the church in the west gallery, and the console is down at the front in the chancel area. The case is from the organ that was built by Samuel Warren in the 1840s. And the case was then extended slightly by Casavant in the early 1900s, and the organ was rebuilt in the 1950s. So basically the organ is a kind of mixture or amalgam of three different periods. What I find interesting is that each time the organ was rebuilt, most of the pipes were included in the new rebuild. So now we have a few pipes from the 1840s, a lot of pipes from the 1880s, and pipes from the 1900s and the 1950s. When Casavant rebuilt the organ, they rebuilt the mechanism as an electro-pneumatic system, which eventually allowed the console to be moved down to the chancel area. The original organ by Warren was a tracker action instrument, which means that there was a direct mechanical linkage between the keyboards and the pipes, which is actually the most musical solution. It enables the organist to really control the speech of the pipes. So eventually we have a long-term project. If we can rebuild the organ, we'd like to rebuild it as it was in the 19th century, in the 1880s, which would mean rebuilding it with tracker action, and the console would be upstairs again in the back gallery with the pipes of the organ.
Right.
Yeah.
We've also now have a second organ in the chancel. Could you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, this is actually quite an exceptional circumstance. The chancel organ in the church is a chamber organ instrument that was built in the late 18th century in 1792. It's actually dated on the nameplate, 1792. And it was built as a house organ in England for a house close to Sheffield. And it's had a rather eventful life, but it eventually ended up in a collection of musical instruments in Ontario that was put together by Gordon Jeffrey. And on his death, it was bequeathed to the city of Montreal, and from Montreal, it came to the cathedral this year. And the interesting thing about it is, of course, that it's almost contemporary with the cathedral. It was built in more or less the same period as the cathedral. And so it was built in this in a Georgian-style case which fits in very well with the other furnishings in the cathedral. And it's used to accompany the choir at the front of the church and as a chamber organ, a chamber music instrument for concerts and recitals.
Benjamin, could you tell us a bit about the cathedral choir?
Yeah, the choir is a group of semi-professional singers that meets on Sunday mornings before the service, and we practice the music we'll be singing for the service. It currently has about 12 or 15 members. It's not a men's and boys choir, it's a choir of men's and women's voices. But everyone in the choir is a strong sight reader, and we get through a lot of music. And basically we do English repertoire from about the Tudor period onwards. There's an enormous body of music that's suitable for the Anglican service, and a lot of it is of very high quality. And we also have a focus on a cappella singing. We try to do as much music as possible without accompaniment.
What is the importance, do you think, of music in a kind of philosophical way in our worship life here at the cathedral?
From my own experience, going to other services and from the comments I receive from people after the service, the music is an important part of the service because it expresses what can't necessarily be expressed through other means. So it kind of completes the message that you get from the readings and from the sermon. It's also that there's some music that is sung by the congregation with the choir and the organ, the hymns and so on. And there's other music that is sung just by the choir. And I think really it just kind of fills out the service, and it more or less fills the gaps of what hasn't been covered by the readings and the sermon.
Benjamin, thank you very much for participating in this video.
Thank you, it was a pleasure for me too.
Yes, this is a wonderful old building, and there's many fascinating things about it, and and the treasures here. But if it was just a historic building and a collection of treasures, then we'd be nothing more than a museum. The fact is, this is the home of a vibrant and caring community of Christians whose faith in God means something and reaches out beyond the walls of this sanctuary into the world. To tell us a bit about the community and about our involvement in the larger Quebec City region, I've invited Louisa Blair, a member of our cathedral choir, the mother of one of the kids in the Sunday school, and the daughter of one of the oldest families in our cathedral community, to come and speak to us today.
It's a community for me, it's a community for my daughter. You know, I sing in the choir so often I don't even see her all Sunday morning, but she's here and she's either with her grandparents or she's with any other member of the community. I always know that she's well looked after. There's a group of about 10 or 15 other kids in Sunday school, and she's with them, and they're of all ages, from very young to to 16, 17. And they all know her, and she looks, they're her friends, and I don't even have to think about her. I know she's having a great time. So she's having a wonderful community experience in this cathedral.
Are children generally welcomed here? Or?
Oh yeah, yeah. I think it's a really great place for children, and there's not very many churches in Quebec City where there's a strong presence of children, because people have left the church in droves. But here there's a real community of children, and there's a wonderful Sunday school. We have 2 guys running the Sunday school who are doing a fantastic job. They're really committed. They do wonderful things with the kids, and no, I think it's amazing. I'm just astonished.
Now, is it fair to say that this community is more about Sunday morning? I mean, what else is going on that you find of interest in?
Well, one of the things that I'm very involved in is we started up a project sponsoring refugees from Central Africa, people who have been separated from their families by war, and there would be 1 or 2 members here in Quebec, and we would sponsor the other members to come and join them. And we're expecting our 2nd family now. This project's been going for about 3 years, and I find it hugely enriching and rewarding, and because of the contact with such a different culture, and it's real outreach. And I believe that any community will not survive unless it reaches out of itself. It's the same as human beings. If you don't reach out of yourself, you die. You go inside and you die. Right. And so I think that's what this community is doing, and the people have been so generous in sponsoring these refugees. They are so generous. They've just come together. We've got this big committee now that's not just of our community, but of other churches in the city, who are enthusiastically jumping onto this project.
So could you tell us what the name of the project and how that name came about?
It's called the Noella Project because the first person that we attempted to sponsor was a 16-year-old girl. I had met her sister previously, and her sister had been separated from Noella since Noella was 11, and they had been, as a family, under fire in the jungle, and they fled in different directions. And Noella, at the age of 11, got separated from the rest of her family, and they didn't know where she was or if she was alive for several years. And when I met her sister, she had just discovered that Noella was actually alive and still living in the Congo with a religious community. And she said, "Is there any way you can help me to bring Noella here to join us?" And so I sort of thought, well, I belong to this wonderful community. Surely together we can do something. And so Noella is now here at school and with her family, and the next people we sponsored were her mother and another sister. So we've brought that family together, and we're now moving on to some other families who've been separated by war.
Now, is this the only, is Noella Project the only activity that the cathedral's involved in?
Another outreach project that we're involved in is which is historically, the cathedral has always been involved in helping immigrants and people arriving at the port of Quebec. And so another way that we're doing that is by helping the sailors sailors are coming into the port of Quebec on container ships, and often they're crews from Vietnam, from the Philippines, from India, and they're not well enough dressed. They often are stuck in this freezing cold winter city. They can't believe it. And the Maison des Marins helps to give them enough clothes to wear while they're in Quebec. And at Christmas we collect shoe boxes full of presents for them, because they stay here over Christmas, and they've got families back home, and they're stuck in this ship, often in the middle of the river, over Christmas. So we collect, as a congregation, we collect shoe boxes and give them to them.
Thanks very much, Louisa, for taking the time to participate in this video.
It's a pleasure.
Well, I hope you've enjoyed this visit of the Anglican Cathedral of the Holy Trinity here in Quebec City. Perhaps you've come to share some of my own sense of awe and appreciation for this marvelous old place, for the building, its treasures, most of all its people and its living tradition. In fact, maybe you'd like to consider becoming a member of our extended family by joining the Friends of the Cathedral. There are memberships available both on an annual and a lifetime basis, and members receive an annual mailing and are kept informed of cathedral happenings. And this way you can contribute to the ongoing preservation of this place. For more information, you can go to our website at www.quebec.cathedral.ca, or you can call the office at area code 418-692-2193. Well, thank you for spending the time with us today. May God bless you in every way.